All right, guys, welcome back to the Yes That Means Yes podcast. My name is Faith Nomchef. I'm the prevention educator with Rape Counselors, and today I have on 5 men who are going to be talking with me about healthy masculinity. So I'm going to go ahead and let them kind of introduce themselves, kind of talk about themselves a little bit, and their viewpoint, where they're coming from. Greg, do you mind starting us off?
Not at all. My name is Greg Baeza, 42 years old. I am a high school teacher in Atlanta. I'm finishing up my 15th year of teaching. I actually have to leave maybe in an hour or so to go to a graduation. And I grew up in New York, went to school in Atlanta, went back to New York for a while, then Los Angeles, and now back in Atlanta. Very, very much enjoying teaching and very excited about this conversation today.
Yeah, I'm Jacob Myers, 23. I'm in the Army, currently stationed in North Carolina. Been in the Army for about 4.5 years. Yeah, just excited to be on here.
I'm Dr. Jody Long, professor of social work at Jacksonville State University. I've been there the past 2 years. Prior to that, I was at Arkansas State University in their Department of Social Work. And prior to that, I was at the University of Tennessee Health Science Center for 17 years and been a clinician, licensed clinical social worker for 28 years. Taught a variety of classes, including case management, domestic violence, as well as psychopathology. So I also look forward to our discussion today.
Hello, my name is Andrew Hamilton. I'm 31 years old. My wife and I have been married for 6 years now, and we have 2 young kids. The youngest, which is 6 months old. So, and then my family has owned and operated McDonald's for a long time. We're in the Northeast Alabama market.
My name is Blake Noah, and I am 25 years old, and I currently live in the Chattanooga area, and I work at Volkswagen as a material planning forecaster. But I grew up in Gadsden, Alabama, and I spent most of my time in that area. And I just got married in this past May, so this Saturday will be 3 weeks since the wedding.
All right, thank you guys so much for introducing yourselves. We have a lot of kind of like discussion points, and I'm just going to ask the questions, and I'm just going to let you guys talk because I don't want to give my opinion on healthy masculinity. I want y'all's. So we're just going to go ahead and start. The first question is, what does healthy masculinity mean to you? And anyone can jump in. There's no order or anything.
Okay. To me, healthy masculinity is basically, to some extent, actualizing, gender roles, but not to the point where, there's kind of emotional damage to the men themselves, but and certainly manifests in relationships with the women in our lives.
I agree with Greg, especially a part about causing undue harm with accepting your masculinity. That we as men, our challenge is to grow up respecting and valuing women in our lives. And that means family members, colleagues at school when we're in school, our school age years, and also in the workplace. But to be healthy is to include a lot of value and respect.
I agree with Dr. Long that I think respect is a huge part of it, for just all the people around you, women and men included in that, I think. And just being able to kind of communicate openly about different emotions, stuff that you may be feeling, I think as kind of one of those things that men have had a lot of problems with before, is just kind of being open to talk about things. that they might feel a little uncomfortable or vulnerable about. So kind of, being open to that idea.
So I believe healthy masculinity has a lot to do with using your natural strengths as a man for the glory of God and for the strength. Like, for instance, using your strength to protect and provide for your family. Using your leadership to better society in some way, or using your love of nature to protect and prosper the earth. Using those things that are naturally more dominant in you as a man to better the area around you.
I would kind of agree with some of the things that Andrew was saying. I think I would probably also tack on there something that a couple of the other guys were saying, was that another one of the things that I think that should be more in control in men in a healthy masculine kind of way is emotional control. To use that in a way that where you were open and honest and able to engage with the people around you and not be closed off from those people. I think that's pretty healthily masculine, and I think that's paired with the kind of responsibilities, other responsibilities of masculinity and the strength that's associated with those. I think I also pair that with the wisdom and the wisdom to use those facets of masculinity in the right times, right? Because I think there are times where people use those in an inappropriate way when it is not the appropriate time to use those things, and that's kind of where things go south.
Okay, thank you, Blake. You're leading me right into the next question. Okay, so what about toxic masculinity? What does that mean to you guys? How do you view that?
Well, to me, I think before defining toxic masculinity, I think it's important to acknowledge that a lot of toxic masculinity is rooted in good intention. Trying to protect women and show them respect, maybe in an unhealthy way or to an unhealthy extent, where some of the ways that we try to kind of protect the women in our lives might actually end up being kind of demeaning and initially starting from a point of men have to be strong, women have to be weak, and it's our job to protect them, and just coming from it again, well intended, but instantly puts us in boxes as both men and women, and creates an imbalance, which can lead to negative outcomes in relationships.
I think if I kind of want to hit on something that you were talking about that the relational aspect between the men and women, when we think about specifically like the protection aspect of masculinity, I think it definitely comes down to the intention and the perspective behind that, because I think that if someone goes into it with the mindset of, I have to protect the women because there's no way they could protect themselves or they can't lead themselves at all, I think it's more along the lines of, women can do these things, but it's partially my masculine role and my gift to them, seeing that they can do these things, but it is my gift to them, or it's part of my responsibility to help take some of that weight off of them and bear that weight as my own. Like whether that's the planning certain things in your family or working for your family, like both people can do those kind of things. And I think that part of the male role is knowing that, let's say in a husband-wife kind of scenario, that your wife can do work to help provide for the family, but as it's also, I think, given as our responsibility to take, as our gift to them is to take as much as we can off of them, not because we think they're weaker, but just kind of as our service back to them in a way. I think that comes back to the perspective of why you do it in the first place. Because if you do it from a place of, well, I respect them so much that I want to help take some of this burden, I don't think that's very toxic. But if it comes from the place of, I have to do this because there's no way they could do this on their own, I think that's a bad mindset towards it.
I'll jump in.
I think just like
Next. Andrew, go ahead.
Okay. Well, I think just like you can use your natural strengths for the benefit of your family or for the benefit of society or benefit of for those around you, it can very easily change. You could use your strength in a way that comes out as violence, or you could use your leadership that comes across as dominance, or anything along those lines. And anything in that form is going to be toxic. And really has to be, I guess, from a men's perspective, has to be toned down, controlled.
Well, I like the fact that we first started talking about misintended toxicity and how sometimes males, especially the younger males, will simply make mistakes in their relationships based on trying to be the male figure and the man of the household. They're able to learn that and evolve and grow from their mistakes, and I'm all for that. I think also we have too what we see in the newspapers as toxic masculinity, where men objectify women, demean women, are guilty of domestic violence and harm. And so that particular population, we have to remember those who harm were once harmed. So they've grown up with this harmful fiction of what a male is to be. What we know about resilience too is that if you have a poor parental figure, if you have one positive influence, you're able to rise above that harm and embrace being a positive person at some point in time in your life.
I think a fair amount it kind of stems from the like alpha male mentality, of being, as some of them were saying, the dominant one, like maybe the breadwinner or whatever. You have to take charge of everything, and then taking it too far, not kind of letting off the gas on that and just becoming maybe a little aggressive or violent in situations that you don't need to be. So.
I definitely think that it relates to back when you use the masculine traits about you in a selfish way where you are not thinking about the people around you. I think that's when it becomes toxic, because it becomes promoting yourself above the people around you. And I don't think that really turns out well for anybody.
All right, thank you. So you guys have all kind of said like decently similar things throughout this, and I know at least for most of you, you've kind of like grown up, been raised in Alabama, or at least southern states, so this also might be kind of similar. But growing up, how was gender discussed? Like, were there certain things boys did? Were there certain things girls did? Just touch on that a little bit, kind of share your experience.
I can start out, maybe a little older here. So when I was raised, it was like females handled everything in the house, including cooking, cleaning, and all points in between. And males handled outside of the house, in the yard and the cars. Those were the two dominant themes growing up in rural Georgia.
I would say mine was pretty similar to that. Guys do the outside, girls do the inside. As I mean, just to put it simply. Sure, it's more complicated than that, but one thing I was always taught growing up: a man should always love God first, love your wife second, love your kids third. All else comes after. So that's kind of been the thing that's been instilled in me growing up, especially from my father as we were being raised.
I would say that mine is fairly similar as well. I don't think it was ever something that was just outspokenly said like, hey, you're my male child, so you're going to do all the outside chores. It was just more of, that's just kind of tended to be what happened. Like if dad was outside, I would end up outside with him doing the chores, and then my sister would just end up inside with mom. It wasn't like a, hey, you can't stay inside and fold laundry. It was just a how it just kind of naturally happened. But I had a thought. I'm sorry. Totally lost it. It'll come back. I'm going to mute myself.
I think as much as, gender roles are kind of, taught just through household, obligations and responsibilities. I feel like the media that almost all of us were subjected to growing up just really reinforced, these gender roles. Boys played with guns, and girls played with dolls, and these are things that are often more impactful than the conversations that are being had or not had. Where even if you're having if parents are having conversations about non-traditional gender roles and trying to break some of the stereotypes, if you're still seeing it every day in cartoons and in toys and in school, that will often overpower the verbal discussions, because again, you have a conversation, and if that conversation not being followed up by meaningful demonstrations of non-traditional gender roles, then you'll just kind of revert back to what you're seeing and living every day. So yeah.
Yeah, I grew up in a house of all brothers, so we never really had any kind of conversation like that. Kind of all the chores were split across the five of us, whether it was inside or outside. But yeah, it was definitely in the movies and TV shows and things of kind of that, you'd see the different roles kind of portrayed like that. And I think that's really the where I saw it the most, and kind of maybe the most impactful on it overall for me.
So I know we've kind of talked about household roles and maybe even roles in relationships and stuff, but what about emotions and even careers? Were there different expectations or just unspoken things? Because I know we can all kind of be like, oh, STEM was for men up until a certain number of years ago. So what about that? Especially emotions. I just want to hear your thoughts. Were you allowed to express emotions in your household? Was it more encouraged for the women in your life to express emotions than you?
There was a difference. There was a huge difference that men were expected to express anger and anger only. Is that okay? And usually to be non-toxic at persons outside the household. Women could express softer feelings and could cry and comfort each other. But if a male cried, especially when I was growing up, if a male cried, everybody was like, whoa, ow. They were aghast. They saw a male crying. And so there was this great divide between emotions and being vulnerable. Men were not allowed to be vulnerable. Women could be vulnerable and take a risk and take a chance and try different roles and activities and tasks. Men were really not allowed to be vulnerable. And so, hence, I think a lot of men grew up, if they weren't really good at something, they wouldn't try. Maybe try it once. If they weren't really good at it, no way. And we kind of grew up with this John Wayne, throw back into the 60s here, John Wayne mentality, where you rush in and save the day and are strong and but show no emotion. That was kind of the mentality that I grew up with. Now, today, I think there's more of a blending of that, especially when I entered social work, which is predominantly female. there's more of an enmeshment of you can show some emotion. It's okay to show your soft feelings, and you need to.
I don't think I was ever told specifically, men cannot cry, or anything. It was just kind of, I guess, what I saw. Never really saw my dad cry. If I did, it was serious. Mom cried. It was not as serious. It was more acceptable, but that was just kind of the culture, I guess, of the family I was in. I don't necessarily think that was ever, specifically said, hey, you are a man, you can't cry.
Yeah, I think that there were certain instances where, showing emotion and specifically crying, are considered acceptable for men, but they're super specific. Death in the family, no one's going to judge. In fact, not crying when a close relative dies, would be, maybe looked at in a certain way. And with sports, if you're in like an undeniably masculine, setting like sports, if you cry, especially out of joy, that's an example of passion that's, expected and, tolerated. In that type of environment. And again, when an athlete, a football player cries, out of joy or because they lost, that's okay because it's within a context of, again, this ultra, masculine environment. But just in everyday life, there's definitely, expectation for men to, stay strong or just to not have those emotions, in the first place, let alone show them.
I think that part of that stems from the strength that is kind of expected of men, whether it was in the older time setting or even in today's standards. It's still somewhat an expectation of men to be the strong point in, let's say, a household, right? And so let's use the funeral example. Yes, it's definitely okay to cry, and I've cried at many funerals, and so has my father. But I feel like there's a higher level of an emotional control that is almost expected of men. Like you can be emotional in those times, but someone has to be slightly more in control and slightly stronger so that other people can lean in on them when they are not as strong. So while it was never just outright spoken to me, said, hey, you're going to have to be, more emotionally concealed, or not show emotions. I think I've learned to show, as many emotions as the next person. But I think that is something that you definitely pick up on, being raised from someone from, some of those generations in the 80s, 70s. So I think that that's something you can pick up on, even if it wasn't explicitly taught to you. And I don't think that either is really wrong, whether it's, showing a whole bunch of emotions or being a little bit more stoic. I think that comes down to just personal experience and personal preference of expression. I think that both can be healthy. I don't think that one way is necessarily wrong compared to the other. I just think that there's more of an expectation for males to be able to maybe not compress emotions, but maybe just set them to the side and process them when they're less vulnerable. I think there is definitely a negative view or a frowned uponness of being vulnerable, specifically in certain circumstances.
And also, I just to follow up on that, in situations of like a family crisis, where that strength is really kind of needed, it's usually the women, who really step up and hold everything together and really show the strength, and actualize that strength that, stereotypically is expected from men. And yet then we, as soon as the crisis passes, we reassume our, expected gender roles and almost forget that the women were, the strength, when it really mattered.
I think it kind of comes down to like, you can have these emotions and things, but you don't really outwardly express them a whole lot, especially around a whole lot of people or maybe people you don't know. it's like okay to feel them, but kind of keep them to yourself or whatever. Just so you don't appear as vulnerable again, in front of people you don't know or whatever.
All right. So where do you guys believe that your beliefs on masculinity stem from?
I can go first. I think a lot of my beliefs on masculinity have, I think, just primarily two places. One is from just watching my dad throughout my childhood, because I feel like that's probably your first influence on. If you're lucky enough to grow up with a father in the household, that's probably your first influence in terms of masculinity, is watching a father or maybe a male relative, whether it's a grandfather, an uncle, or something like that. So I think that's definitely where a lot of my beliefs come from. But then I think probably more importantly is I've spent pretty much my entire life in the church. And so a lot of that is kind of the biblical view of marriage and the example of Jesus kind of both help, that and the image of my father both help me see the good and where maybe my dad has fallen short in some places, right? Because nobody's perfect. So I think being able to see both and seeing what it's supposed to be, and then seeing in practice the struggles and the difficulties that are associated with that, and being able to watch that as I've grown up, has really shaped my perspective on masculinity.
Yeah, I think I'd have to say it probably started with like my dad and my grandfather, and then growing up with my brothers, kind of seeing the things that they did and being around them, because they probably don't realize it, but they're older. They're obviously going to be role models. And then outside the house, I have like sports coaches. They're out there, they're leading these groups of young men and kind of helping develop them early on. So I think I kind of look to them every now and then too, to see kind of how it was different from the house.
It's odd because besides the, I guess, reinforcement of traditional roles, I did grow up in New York, very, very liberal place. And I remember there was, and it comes back to me periodically, there was something that we watched. There was a special that they watched, the days when the teacher just, I don't know, was probably hungover. They wheel in like the VCR. And there was specifically something called Free to Be You and Me. Okay, I don't know if anyone remembers this, but it was, I think, made in the 70s. And, I grew up, they showed this throughout the 80s. And there was one thing that really stuck with me, and it was Rosie Greer, who was a football player, I think a lineman, singing a song called It's All Right to Cry, specifically, and showing men, crying and basically just acknowledging that it was okay. And this is something we saw probably, once a year, maybe twice a year, from like kindergarten through third or fourth grade. And that stuck with me. And I super recently, just coincidentally, kind of was sharing this with somebody. It popped up, and I watched a couple more of the skits, and it had some people like Michael Jackson, Roberta Flack, Mel Brooks. It was a weird variety thing put together by Marlo Thomas. And I didn't understand, but the whole thing, all of them were like vignettes about, and little sketches about gender roles, and just kind of, challenging traditional roles. And again, this was put together in the 70s. So there was a lot of talk, I guess, coming out of the, free love movement of the 60s and just general awakening, where there was attempts to, change the conversation. And I don't know if it really widespread really had the impact that it could have, but it stuck with me. So it did something. So this was something that was, again, positive attack on traditional roles that did stick with me. And I don't know how many, where in the country and in what years this was kind of shared, but I'm grateful, but I didn't really realize it. And that's, I think, what made it very effective, was that it was, something that I didn't really process what it meant. It was just something that, I enjoyed, and the songs, stuck with me.
Like that. I remember Rosie Greer also knitted as well. And there's, again, back to this blending of some of the traditional gender roles that when I grew up, men did the driving. That was, and they did it from day one until they died, or until they physically could not drive. And female was the passenger. Then in the last 20 years, we've had this shift. I mean, we've even had a female professional race car driver that has role modeled that for females and for males. I remember one time I broke my right ankle and I could not drive. I could not use my right foot. I couldn't cross over with the left. So that left me to the mercy of my wife driving. And then when I could drive, we had this negotiation. Wait, hold up. That's my role. I'm the driver. I just had to take a time out for a period of time. But now we take turns driving. That's one of the traditional or very masculine roles within a couple that we have negotiated and now take turns doing. And there will be some nights she comes in, and I know she regrets it every time she says it, but she'll say, "Can't cook tonight, you're on. You're up." And I'm like, "Okay, all right, yeah." Of course, then the next night she's saying, yeah, I'm ready to cook again. And I've been banned from several kitchens as a result of my attempt to cook. But if I've got a grill outside, I'm good. So I think today we have this shifting of roles and duties that were once entrenched in stone.
So my answer is incredibly similar to Blake's, but the Bible has a lot to say about what roles men and women have in family and church and society, and just how those different strengths apply to those specific areas. So both genders have their own strength and their roles, how those are shown best. But more specifically for me growing up, my dad was very good at words and actions, showing me how to love my family, how to raise my family, and I think I use that. I think I try to follow in his footsteps as much as possible, and I guess also I've always had a craving to be, I'll say, discipled. And I've always reached out to people around me and kind of had that craving for, learning under someone. So when I see somebody that I respect, and I'll seek that person out, and I'll ask them, and we'll spend time together, or whether it's over coffee or over, several sittings and whatnot, hanging out, playing sports, whatever. So I've always kind of reached out through that way.
Great. Thank you guys all for sharing kind of your experiences and your upbringing and how that shaped you. All right. So was there ever a time in your life where you specifically found yourself practicing healthy masculinity or toxic masculinity that you would be willing to share?
Well, I mean, healthy masculinity, I'm recently divorced, and while we were together, I was the one who did the cooking, and it wasn't something that was an issue. It was just I liked cooking. I was a little better at it than my ex, and so again, it wasn't something that was intentional where I'm like, I'm going to break this gender role. It was just, something that just worked out. And, in an unhealthy way, there was an expectation. I had a stepdaughter, and that did play a role. The fact that it was, her dad was still in her life. But I kind of deferred with some child raising stuff to my wife. And sometimes I wonder, if that was my child and not my stepdaughter, if I would be more of an equal partner when it came to, you know, raising her. But definitely, you know, I definitely could have done a better job at times of sharing that burden on an equal footing.
I would say with the army, you know, you're always around mostly, you know, other men kind of doing stuff, and I've caught myself kind of you know, competing and kind of taking it a little too far sometimes, of just trying to be, you know, the the biggest baddest guy around, and like, you know, kind of not putting other people down, but might as well have at that point. Um, and then and kind of vice versa, that I've kind of figured out how to open up about things, be a little bit more vulnerable, and communicate with friends and family, people I'm kind of close to, about things that I'm feeling at the time, or that are bothering me, or whatever it is. So yeah, just kind of getting that openness out.
So I'll hit on maybe both aspects of it pretty quickly. I'd say that on the toxic masculinity side, or maybe just a light example of that, would be um, for younger people, or just thinking back to early years, high school and college dating. I think that the mindset and the intention behind that can become toxic if you're not aware of the reasons why, or even if you are and then you're not really aware of how that may affect the other person. Because I feel like in early relationships, you might just kind of be seeking self-pleasure, whether it's through just dating the person because they're a form of entertainment. They're someone to just say that you are dating, and I feel like that doesn't respect people very well, and that can pretty easily turn into a toxic situation where you are displaying some toxic masculine traits in those kind of situations. But I think that over time you mature and come to a place where you start to practice more healthily masculine traits. Like in my current relationship with my wife Shay, I think every day I'm thinking about not only her but just us as a couple and our future. So I'm always in my mind, there's always a gear turning that's thinking about the future planning, because part of me feels responsible for the longevity and the life of our marriage. And so I'm always trying to be intentional with that, and trying to provide for those means as we're both working together for those things. But I think that working together and having that plan are a way that I practice my healthy masculinity in my long-term planning of the marriage.
Well, I can share on this very quickly.
Yeah, no, of course.
So a few years ago, I worked at the University of Tennessee in an outpatient clinic, and I was there along with one other male clinician. And they asked me to start up an outpatient psychotherapy group. And I had 2 female graduate interns doing their placement with me that year. And so when I started this group, I thought, okay, I'm in charge of the 2 female interns. In my first group, I had 6 females in the group. And so I went robustly charging into this group thinking, I got this. I'm in charge. My masculinity was at full strength. And one of the ladies in the first group asked me, have you ever chopped cotton? And I had never chopped cotton in my life. And I was thinking, whoa, because these ladies, these 6 ladies, were from a different race, were from a lower socioeconomic status, that lived very, very hard lives in Mississippi and had migrated to Memphis in their later years. And I rolled it over in my mind, and I said, is she really asking me if I've chopped cotton, or can I understand what her life may be? Thank goodness I thought of that. And I said, have not chopped cotton. I answered, not chopped cotton. I've baled hay. And she nodded her head in approval. And she sensed that I could value what she had to say. And it really shifted my mindset from trying to be in charge and manage this group, learning as well as leading, but also learning from these females about their lives and valuing them for who and what they were, what their experiences had been. I had this dramatic shift from one side to the other in leading. And when I talk about that in presentations, I usually get choked up talking about it because it's such a sentimental experience and memory for me. But that was incredible.
I think my most important opportunity for healthy or toxic masculinity, either one, is centered around my daughter and raising her. So I always try to be intentional with my behaviors around her and just raising her. And I talk to Emily about it all the time, my wife. Just what things would teach her and grow her in strength, because she is incredibly strong and bad-tempered sometimes, but I want to I want to direct that. I don't want to hinder her strength. I'd rather direct it in a more positive way. But let's so just things like I make sure she sees me do things like hug, kiss my wife, cook her breakfast in the morning sometimes, and hold her hands when we're walking. Specifically to her, I tell her every day, I love you. And I try to do that verbally and through my actions. I actively teach her. We'll read books together, or, we'll do flashcards, or, things like that. Throw the ball around, whatever. Just enjoy each other's company. So I think that's probably my most dominant opportunity for masculinity.
Thank you guys all so much for sharing. For the listeners, I made this question optional, but everyone still agreed to share. So thank you. I'm impressed. Thank you for being vulnerable and sharing that. But we kind of want to move, before we get to our last question, in a more positive note, what are things that we can do to encourage the boys and men in our lives to practice healthy masculinity? I'm not talking a 6-step intervention plan, just what are the daily things that we can do? Just small things.
Well, you know what? Go ahead, Andrew.
Well, I think we as a society can be quick to demonize anything that's different from what we're used to or from what we're raised to believe. So if I'm raised to think that masculinity is this and femininity is this, then anytime I see someone who's different than that or falls outside of that spectrum that I built in my head, then it is easy to kind of demonize that in a for lack of a better word. But I think what we need to do in order to help men practice healthy masculinity is encourage men to use your strengths for good, and not to shy away from your strengths, because I think a lot of the news and things like that is the toxic masculinity. Anything that involves strength is negative. Anything that involves leadership is negative. But it's really not. If you use your strength and you use your leadership to build up your family or your society around you, then those are very good things, and they're versions of healthy masculinity. There's a reason that kids are more successful when both parents are in the family, and it's that they are raised with good examples of both femininity and masculinity.
Yeah, I would say, again, just the role that media plays in reinforcing, toxic masculinity. I think it's almost largely the media's responsibility in different ways to, combat that. And it speaks directly to, individuals, who have a platform, just demonstrating, characteristics that go against traditional roles, and just athletes, especially for men, since sports is such a major, influence and focal point of young men and older men. Whenever an athlete has a chance to be vulnerable and discuss things like mental health issues, it has an impact. And so I would say that, people who have that platform, they also have a responsibility in a lot of ways, but especially, with combating traditional gender roles, and just, encouraging men to be more vulnerable without the negative stigma.
I think it starts with action. You can say like all the things you want, but until like you're kind of doing it, you're showing people as an example. You being the example for these other people, then what you say would have more weight to it.
And I think to kind of build on that, I think that there's an absence just in the culture today of people willing to share the good examples of healthy masculinity with both, younger boys growing up and even, guys our own age. I think that it's if we had more people willing to, talk through and act through the right things, the right ways to show your masculinity, that there'd be even more people out there practicing the healthy masculinity in the healthy kind of ways. And I think that the more of that there is in the world, whether it's raising kids and showing them the example, kind of like what Andrew talked about, or if it's just, getting together with a group of guys and sharing your life experiences and talking through the way you've handled things and how you plan to handle them going forward, knowing the things that you know now, I think that's extremely healthy for the group and for society as a whole.
I agree with that wholeheartedly, and I'd like to go back to what Greg said earlier. I think we just need a few more Rosie Greers around today to model knitting and being able to cry in public and embrace their feminine energy. I like that example a lot.
Yeah, and just as a negative, when Michael Jordan, when he cried, effusively and was kind of made into a meme because of it, that goes a long way in reinforcing these negative attitudes towards masculinity. And it's one thing to you go from demonizing being vulnerable and emotional to allowing it. It's you can't necessarily cancel out a negative with a zero, meaning that you can't necessarily be neutral and expect to make a dramatic difference long term. Instead of just allowing men to be vulnerable, celebrating it almost needs to be done to combat, because there's so much pull in the negative direction that you have to pull in the other direction to balance it out. So hopefully we start getting to a point where, again, men showing emotions is not just tolerated or accepted, but celebrated. And until we get there, I don't think we're going to see any dramatic shifts in our current state of where we are in terms of gender roles.
Awesome. Thank you. Those were all great suggestions of everyday things that we could do, and just as men, how you can kind of like portray yourselves and act. When we finish this podcast, we always ask our guests one question to finish it up, and that is, what is your message to survivors of sexual assault?
Well, I'll start with this. Survivors of sexual assault, that it's not your fault, and you can heal from this. There are methods and techniques and psychotherapy to heal from that if that's a choice. But you can put that behind you and then use that, and at some point in time, possibly use that as a strength to help others who have also suffered from assault. Yeah, definitely not your fault.
I would say that the way that you've been treated is not the way that you deserve to be treated. I believe that everyone, male and female, is created in the image of God, and that you deserve and you have the dignity that entails, and that the way you were treated is not the way that men are supposed to treat another person, whether it's a male or female. That's not how you're supposed to treat another person.
I would say again, first and foremost, just echoing, what Jody said, and Blake as well about it, not being their fault at all. Doesn't matter what you're wearing, what you said. The responsibility lies entirely on the men to not be assaulters, to not assault, and it's not the responsibility should not be for the women to defend themselves from it. And just that, you deserve to be believed. Sexual assault comes in many forms, and none of them are, should be tolerated. And if you feel violated, then you were violated. And it doesn't matter if the men's, what the intention was, how extreme it was. If you felt, uncomfortable, then that's something that, shouldn't be tolerated or accepted, and something that we as men, need to do a better job of just acknowledging, all the forms that sexual violence, takes place in. And yeah, none of it's acceptable.
I would have to say is just know that you haven't lost any value. So something like this happens, it says more about the person that did it than it does about the victim. And I think kind of coming to terms with that of just understanding you're still just as valuable as you were before. And as everyone said before, it's not your fault.
Yeah, so I would say, you're not alone. You are not unloved. You're not unlovable. You're not, and you can feel safe again, through time and through, just being with other people. Sin in general has broken the world, and it's negatively affected everyone, some much more than others, clearly. But, Jesus did come to pay the sacrifice for that sin, and eternally speaking, there is no pain if you believe in that, and you can be free from that regret of the sin or from someone else's sin.
Okay. Again, thank you all so much for joining us. It's been great hearing all of your perspectives, and I just appreciate, taking the time to just sit down to talk about this. So that's all we have for you guys. Thank you so much, and I will see you on the next podcast. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.